Good day, folks. I hope you're doing well. All things considered. Mask up, vote, do all that fun, good stuff you got going on. Today, though, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the United States and its democracy, or a lack thereof. So first things first, though, there's a common... I don't even know what to call it. Thing amongst conservatives. I should say those on the right about the United States and saying, the U.S. is not a democracy, it's a republic, right? Beyond how ridiculously pedantic this thing is, or that statement is, and a lot of times not just willfully obtuse, but its intention is to justify minority rule and to dismiss concerns of access to voting rights and democracy and all sorts of things down the line. Well, one, I mean, apparently some of these folks are sincere. It's hilarious on how anti-civic 101 and an appeal to ignorance this argument really is. In so far much as, by definition, a republic is a form of democracy, where, there's the common definition, or really the, not common, but the small definition of democracy in a sense of voting for whatever, really. In the broad sense, it's voting for every explicit law and governing by vote and everything down the line. But there are sub-definitions, subgenres of democracy: a republic, a constitutional republic, which we are, constitutional republic, democracy, blah, 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 down the line, are things that we fill up, right? A common definition of democracy is government by the people, exercised either directly through elected or through elected representatives. And what is republic? American Heritage Dictionary calls a republic a political order in which the supreme power lies in a body of citizens who are entitled to vote for officers and representatives responsible to them. So representative democracy is a republic is a representative democracy, a republic is a democracy. Founding fathers like John Adams identifying things as much and using the terms interchangeably between democracy and republic. So effectively what you're saying is you're just labeling the type of democracy that we are by saying we're not a democracy, by calling the United States a republic. It's just a label of a type of democracy. So a democracy in the colloquial use, meaning mass use, is a catch-all for different forms or the type of, or different forms of democracy, or within the context of whatever country you're talking about it in. So if you're talking about democracy in France, you're going to be talking about how it presents itself in France, right? Within the colloquial use of talking about politics within France and its state as a democracy. In the state, and talking about or using democracy in the context of the United States, or talking about it within how it has come to present itself within the United States as a constitutional republic democracy. So that's first things first. And honestly, that's Civics 101, and a lot of times it's, again, used as a bad faith argument against, majority rule in the United States. But how are we not a democracy? Well, for one, we have an electoral college, which has the capability to not be majority rule. And it means basically it plays into kind of two ends, both a not full representation by a majority within the House, as well as not the popular vote being that within voting for the President of the United States. There were interesting intersections of how the Electoral College came about. But one of those core intersections was that of the slave states, primarily in the South, which are smaller in populations of those, at least, that were allowed to vote. So there was a real fear that they would be governed by a president that didn't have their interests in mind. And the Electoral College effectively solidified power of the slaveholding states uh, for a long time within the United States. And it's a legacy of slavery in a real way in the United States. Like much of the structure of the United States, on one hand, there were some other reasons why it was created. But on the other hand, there's some real reasons that it was created to help maintain and spread slavery or really a racialized caste system within the United States. That was very much a part of its creation. So it's very much rooted within that. Even though there are some other reasons, it's still a major reason was that of the protection of slavery. So it was really a convoluted way meant to protect lower population states. So far much as that the 3/5 compromise came about to help protect these smaller states, where mostly slave states agreed to be. Basically, this compromise helped these slave states agree to be part of the Union. So again, slavery was this core function in the founding of the Union and why it was able to come together. And this has been a constant conflict and a core hypocrisy within the United States. These two things that are true at the same time, where there's been a want to spread democracy, but at the same time roll it back. This has been a core conflict within the United States within its founding, and one that we ultimately have to resolve somehow, some way. And the 3/5 compromise event basically gave the slave states an advantage. And currently this is a lineage right now in how we count prison populations within congressional districts and how they count in within as well the Electoral College. But those in prisons can't vote. And oftentimes wouldn't be living where that prison is located if they weren't in jail. So our carceral state and our prison industrial complex are also anti-democratic institutions in real ways that help preserve a lot of times power in the hands of, well, conservatives, which are a minority in this country and in real ways, right? So this whole thing, and even say the idea of fear of tyranny in the minority is an overstated aspect to the Electoral College, to districts and the founding of this country, where people like to quote Madison, but Madison even then, well, he did state his fear of the tyranny of the minority was got a little bit more detail than that. And to quote, he said, I didn't put down my notes, my fault, within the Federalist Papers. You can find this stuff within the Federalist Papers. But he said, really concerned, basically, quote, was more concerned with facetious spirit in the public administration, or factious, I should say. And what are factions? He defines them really as citizens who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So really, we're talking about conservatives of today, where it wasn't necessarily, again, fear of tyranny in the majority or fear of the tyranny in the minority, but it was a group who were united by basically using government of the interests of themselves to hold and to maintain power, and really that the rights of other citizens, and to fight and push back against those rights of other citizens. But you can see some of the core conflicts of the founding of the United States of within that same time period. You had people enslaved and down the line. But okay, let's kind of work through this some of it a bit more. But that was really a fear that he saw amongst those. So it wasn't necessarily, again, to protect tyranny in the majority. And, well, actually, you know what? In a sense, it depends on your perspective. Slaveholders often viewed tyranny as, and this is kind of partly what led up to the Civil War, where they explicitly stated the protection of slavery as an institution was also the protection against tyranny, and calling the ending of slavery that of tyranny. And we see a similar argument today, and even during the civil rights movement, of that those that believed in anti-blackness and mainholding the racial caste system view civil rights, the expansion of civil rights, and the upholding of civil rights as tyranny. The protection of civil rights as tyranny. We still see that today, where people and people on the right are calling Black Lives Matter, the movement itself, not the organization. At times, the organization doesn't matter. Whatever, they're bunk. The people that are opposed to this stuff are bunk, but they view these things as tyranny, or the possibility of tyranny, of viewing the Democrats not just as illegitimate, but wanting to implement tyranny in so much as breaking down the racial caste system as that of tyranny. They want to protect and uphold a racialized caste system that we call white supremacy. And that's what it is. That's what they're looking to do. And they view that as tyranny. Some, make this argument in bad faith. They know exactly what they are. And others make it in good faith and truly believe these things. That somehow the expansion of rights, of human and civil rights, is tyranny, and the protection of those rights is tyranny. They're effectively arguing for their right to discriminate and to uphold a racial caste system. That's what they're arguing for, and that anything that pushes back on their right to be racist is tyranny. So they're saying that their right to act out their racism and to uphold a racial caste system is more important than the freedom of another person. What's tyranny, really? What else do we have going on that makes the United States not a democracy? So we have the Electoral College. We have our voting and voting rights. For much of the United States history, the majority of our population, or large segments of our population, have either been unable to vote or have had their ability to vote extremely, just attacked, right? And constrained in real ways. The 14th Amendment was passed in 1868. And it was explicitly really only black men could vote at this point. This was also viewed as tyranny. But that was quickly rolled back with the institution of Jim Crow laws, which we saw really push all the way up until with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which gave great protections for voting rights. I should say also at this point, though, in 1965, and the lead up and to fight for this, there's a lot of violence that folks voted, and there's still voter intimidation and things like that throughout it. So you have 1965. Also, I should say the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, which allowed white women to vote. And we still had Jim Crow laws, we still had intimidation and polling tests and tax all across the country. And some of these ways to suppress votes weren't just in the South either. But up until 2013, Shelby County versus Holder is when the Roberts Court pushed back on aspects and core aspects of the Voting Rights Act. I should say, even within this time, though, nobody incarcerated could vote. There's still a lot of legacy of across the country within state and a lot of states not allowing former felons to vote, or those like in Wisconsin where they allow those that are felons, convicted felons, to vote as long as they're not incarcerated or on parole. So, we had that throughout. So even I believe those that are incarcerated should have the right to vote. I believe that those that are on parole should have the right to vote. I believe those that are felons should have the right to vote. If we're talking about taxation without representation, we're talking these folks deserve representation, regardless of who you are. You deserve representation. You just do. So you had the pullback of voting rights, and then you had Citizens United. But as soon as these really things were implemented, with the pullback of voting rights, you saw sweeping voter suppression laws being passed all across the country. Wisconsin included, disguised as voter protection. George Herbert Walker Bush and Trump both investigated voter fraud, and they found no evidence of massive voter fraud. Now, you might be able to find like individual instances of this, but a lot of times they were just mistakes. Sometimes it was intentional, but the bottom line, it was basically individual actions and nowhere large enough to actually even come close to impacting elections. So gerrymandering, right? And you have this right now in Wisconsin where and other places where districts are cut in such a way that it maintains power of a certain political party. Now, this is cross-party lines. Right now, Republicans are taking part in it more than Democrats, but we need nonpartisan district reform. And again, it's just an issue of democracy. I don't want partisans. I don't want political parties cutting their own turf. It needs to be nonpartisan reforms for our congressional districts. Then after, though, I should say Citizens United also, sorry to jump around a little bit, money became an extremely important aspect of voting. An Atlantic article published in 2018 cited a couple studies, but one of these was a 2014 study by a political scientist out of Northwestern, explored the impact that wealthy elites have on policy over the masses. And they found that economic elites and narrow interest groups were very influential. They succeeded in getting their favored policies adopted half of the time and in stopping legislation to which they were opposed to nearly all of the time. Mass-based interest groups, meanwhile, had little effect on public policy. As for their views of ordinary citizens, they had virtually no independent effect at all. They found that when the preferences of economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, the preferences of the average American appear to only have a minuscule or near zero statistical, non-significant impact upon public policy. So our votes are mattering less. We have an electoral college that doesn't uphold the support of popular vote. We have districts that are cut really messed up. We have voting suppression laws. Right now, we are not a democracy in a very real sense. Very, very real sense. I mean, we have folks standing in line long hours to vote, and most of these folks are black or brown. The Brennan Justice, and this is based upon the 2018 election, the Brennan Center for Justice estimates that some 3 million voters waited 30 minutes or more to cast their ballot. Like Bipartisan Policy Center estimates that more than 500,000 eligible voters failed to vote in 2016 because of problems associated with the management of polling places, including long waits. The Brennan Center also found that Latino and Black voters were more likely than white voters to wait in the longest lines of Election Day. Some 6.6% of Latino voters, 7% of Black voters reported waiting 30 minutes or longer. Only 4.1% of white voters found that. More generally, Latino voters wait on average 46% longer than white voters, and Black voters waited on average 45% longer than white voters. We see this now with the closing down of polling stations, oftentimes leaving only one county with a polling station. We're seeing this now as well with ballot drop-offs and mail-in, just down the line, tactics to make it harder for people to vote, disguised as so-called security, but it's poorly disguised. Now, there's some folks out there that are true believers in this, but they're quite delusional and brought up in a cult to begin with when it comes to this and taking their word for gospel. And there's plenty of others though that are engaging in bad faith and know exactly what they're doing in using their power as a way to maintain their power. In a lot of ways, none of this really should even matter. Well, I should say some of the stuff with Electoral College and districting really shouldn't even matter. Some of these debates, aspects of these debates, shouldn't matter. We're talking about a debating system that was designed 200 years ago. A system that had a country that had an entirely different population, an entirely different time, that were also attempting to create a new system of government while throwing off the throes of older systems to build a new way. They were focused on progress not sustaining a system that they felt no longer fit the world that they existed in. Now, that was the spirit. Well, the personal motivations, such as the protection of slavery, the want to expand to the West, and more, are absolutely true things. But there's definitely a very real part of the spirit that they saw the current order of no longer being effective in the world that was. They looked forward, not backward, while taking inspiration from the Iroquois Confederacy, as well as Greek and Roman democratic systems. Rome was a republic before it was an empire. Boop. Democratic republic. Well, sort of ish. But so right now we're letting a 200-year-old document hold us back from moving forward. So in that same spirit of realizing the old system is no longer fully relevant today to effective governance, to supporting the interests of the people that it governs, let's move forward. Let's think forward. And let's advance instead of being upholden by something that is no longer totally relevant. That was the spirit then. So these so-called originalists want to reject the spirit of thinking forward. So what are some things that we can do, reforms to make our stuff more democratic? One is absolutely a passage of a voting rights law, not just an act, but a law that guarantees people's a right to vote in such a way that it's non-cumbersome. Maybe mandatory voting like Australia, but there's also an opt-out or a no vote option. Now, there's a problem here that too many Americans view spitting in the face of so-called being forced to do something as their right. Not really being forced, though. Just get up, go, and vote no if you don't have anybody that you want to vote for. But they see this, the opposition as something for the collective good as freedom, and their ability to do so as freedom, even though they would do something that harms the collective good just for their own individual, I don't know, jackassery. I don't know what to call it. But with the no vote option, then they don't have to vote. They can opt out. Many would still be upset, but it provides an option for you not to vote. So don't be too self-absorbed in your individual right to, be that way with your right to vote. You can abolish the Senate and the Electoral College, or at least passing state constitutional amendments to eventually get to the point where the electorates have to vote for the popular vote winner. Wow, forgot the word popular. So you have that. I mean, you should abolish the Senate, and if you want to create another chamber, that's fine. But let's create these things that are proportional in how they represent, as well as nonpartisan district reform. Overturn Citizens United. Implement proportional representation or ranked choice voting, or maybe a combination of votes of both, depending on what chamber or what body of government we're explicitly talking about. Ranked choice voting is where you put down your first choice, your second choice, your third choice, and then basically it kind of like, if there's enough kind of reaching the threshold where everybody votes on their first choice and their depending on how you want to set up either the majority or maybe 45%, there's some kind of democratic threshold on this, versus like the others, if they get even like a plurality and so on and so forth of votes, or they then move on, and then or like the two highest people move on, and so on and so forth. But there's somewhere, your first, basically it makes it so that you don't have to, particularly in primaries, choose somebody you think you might win. It makes it easier to do that. It's a little convoluted, but it definitely makes sense. You just put down, and your second choice might win, your third choice might win. Eventually, you just kind of move down the list, and kind of eliminate people based upon their votes and kind of whittle it down throughout. You might have a second round of voting if need be, but that's very, very rare in places that have implemented it. Proportional representation, I think, kind of explains itself as so far as it's more like voting for a party of sorts, where then they get a set amount of seats. You're not necessarily voting for an individual per se, but they get a set amount of seats based upon the proportionality of their voting within a chamber. So one can be definitely better for a legislative branch, another much better for an executive branch. And then create a set campaign period where there's no outside money and fully publicly financed campaigns. You have maybe 3 months fully publicly financed campaigns, so people, and particularly our House, aren't constantly campaigning and trying to raise funds, fully financed, so everything's kind of equal. And they focus on more time legislation. Expansion of voting rights. Even within that, again, with prisoners, and I think you can make a strong argument that undocumented residents should be able to vote as well, at least in local elections, as, again, this taxation without representation, where even though they might not be paying depending on how they're being paid, a income tax, they're still paying plenty of taxes in various different ways. So right now we're not a democracy. Even through the intent of our systems, we're less of a democracy than we have been in a very long time, since before 1968, right? Or 65. And for much of the United States history, it has not been a fully realized democracy, and there's been a constant fight to have it fully realized. So this election is absolutely part of that fight. The standing in lines is not democratic. In fact, it's anti-democratic. Now, it is the explicit right or explicit actions of exercising the democratic rights for standing in lines. That in itself, but it's not inspiring to democracy. People should not be standing in long lines to vote. It should be as easy as possible. Now, yes, there should be security mechanisms in place to make sure that voter and election fraud aren't there. And quite frankly, when it comes to election fraud and outside influence, we don't have enough mechanisms in place, such as there should always be a paper ballot and better protections of our voting machines. There should always be a paper trail in voting, and we don't have enough of that. But there's a lot more we can do to protect voting and expansion of our voting rights within this country, and to fully realize that it's a democracy. Now, there is a party that is absolutely scared of that, as they realize that they are maybe a permanent minority party. Now, there'd be effectively a reorganization of politics if the will of the majority was actually be able to be seen, where you'd probably end up seeing the Democratic Party break out into two parties, as what is left of the GOP party would be relegated to rotting off. And some of those aspects of the GOP party would join the more moderate aspect of the Democratic Party. But democracy can still live in a real way, as effectively there are multiple parties within the Democratic Party in a real way. But this election is absolutely about the soul of our democracy. It might be the last gasp of our democracy. If Biden wins, we have a long fight to go to bring back the hope of a fully realized democracy. And that needs to be absolutely part of the fight, even if he loses, but especially if he wins, is the expansion of the democracy and the securing of as much part of the rights of people as we can when it comes to voting. On that, thanks for coming to Finding Warmth with Our Sun. I'm Matthew Brown, your host here at Mastin365. Hit subscribe to Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Please mask up and go out and vote if you have not yet. Get your voting plan in order. Know exactly what you're going to do. Know the lines for voter protection. So if you see voter intimidation, you can call and come up on that. This is going to be the last cast before the election comes up. So happy Halloween, if of sorts, and stay safe, folks.
This is 365 Media.